This is the story of the Guatemalan human guinea pigs. Nothing resembles the horror of the Tuskegee Project more than what happened several decades ago in a certain place in Central America. Let's remember for a moment, dear listener, the immorality of the human experiments in Tuskegee, which were based on studies of the impact of syphilis on human health, as we set the stage for this story. Imagine yourself, then, in a corner of the earth where certain scientific immoralities can be committed, without the regulatory and control mechanisms that are usually imposed in many developed countries when it comes to the performance of medical research. And it is precisely with our imagination that we find ourselves now in Guatemala, tirelessly touring its brothels, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, and barracks in search of vulnerable and uninformed subjects to carry out certain macabre tests on their bodies. It is the year 1946. The notorious Dr. John Cutler, who became dubiously famous for his role in the Tuskegee Project, formed a team of colleagues and professionals to enlist more than 1,000 subjects for his nefarious plans. Indeed, there were around 1,300 victims of the atrocities ultimately committed by this team of researchers, if we can call them that. But how do you conduct such a massive experiment which, due to its size, is known to have significant statistical weight, to make it a resounding success from a clinical point of view, and for a moment leaving aside, of course, the moral degradation it represents? Well, they must be divided into participant groups. These groups are meant to receive different treatments in terms of medication doses, but never forgetting that one of the groups should never receive any medical treatment at all. Perhaps only after observing their physical deterioration, which often culminated in their death, these unscrupulous doctors would decide to provide some palliative care. The subjects were infected with horrible venereal diseases, such as syphilis and gonorrhea, without proper informed consent. To make matters worse, only about 700 people received treatment from almost the beginning of their infection, leaving the rest at the mercy of the nature of these very dangerous diseases. And imagine, dear listener, that many of these, more than 1,000 infected people, were free to live as they pleased, meaning they could easily transmit their diseases to others. That's precisely why, after 2 years of infecting all their human guinea pigs, follow-ups were conducted until 1953 on them, and also on a large part of the population that could have been indirectly affected by disease transmission. While the exact figures of the macabre impact of this study are not entirely understood, it is known that by 1953, 83 subjects had already died. And to make matters worse, the follow-up of the indirect impact of the study had to be done in orphanages, state schools, and other places where the most vulnerable population frequented and lived. You may wonder, perhaps, what or who backs up such immoral studies, knowing that support, or at least approval, must come from the government. The answer may be simpler than we imagine: money and war. That's right, dear listener. It is estimated that around 350,000 U.S. soldiers were affected by venereal diseases at that time. In times of war and post-war, that meant losing 2 entire armed divisions for the whole year, and all of that to an annual cost of $34 million in 1943 dollars. The beginnings of these controversial clinical research practices date back to 1943 in Terre Haute, Indiana. They had the support of the United States government and some of its high-ranking military personnel. The initial idea was to use prison inmates to investigate the effect of gonorrhea infection and its subsequent treatment. However, doctors John Maloney and Cassius Van Slyke were finding it difficult to consistently infect the inmates, which is why the experiments were ultimately moved to Guatemala, where Cutler, who had been a disciple of Maloney, became part of the research team's leadership. Certain records, some of which were not even confidential, acknowledged that the experiments carried out in Guatemala would have been practically impossible to conduct in the United States. This was expressed by Dr. Thomas Perrin, who was the Surgeon General at the time. The purpose and details of the experiment had to be hidden from the human guinea pigs. Do you want more specific data about the extent of this immorality? One of the team's deranged original ideas was to inoculate prostitutes with germs incubated in rabbits and then pay them to have sexual intercourse with prisoners. According to the researchers' calculations, on average, a prostitute could have intercourse with up to 10 men in 71 minutes, ensuring a very high infection and transmission rate. Let us also remember the case of Berta, a patient in a psychiatric hospital in the city of Guatemala who was injected in the eyes with pus from another patient affected by gonorrhea and was also injected with syphilis. She only managed to survive for 6 months from the moment she began to be used as a guinea pig, and she was treated with medication only in the last 3 months of her life. Continuing with this list, dear listener, would only provoke more disgust, because you and I know very well the kind of horrible stench that awaits us in the dungeons of science.